First, thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this fantastic symposium. It's really a treat for me to be there among all those eminent professors and doctors. Today, in response to the provocation of the symposium about the opportunities and challenges of mask and head covering and the why rather than the what, I propose to introduce you to a puppetry perspective on masks and how textile designers can embody animated and sensual qualities and provide a material experience for themselves, the viewer, and also for the mask wearer. From inside a continuous learning process, textile designers like Nitikul Nimkulrat listen to the voice of their materials to assemble and gather them into textile artifacts. Experiencing materials through mask making and improvisation is a response to the challenges explored by Karana and all in a conference about emerging textile, where designers investigated a way of thinking about materials towards more unpredictable, non-linear, and open design, and to explore new methodologies for designing with alive, active, and adaptive materials. On the other hand, from a puppetry perspective, mask rather than hide, reveal. And as the entanglement of dead matter and living bodies, masks are a response to Barrett's call to face the inhuman that we are, that is the infinite alterity in its material and lively indeterminacy that lives in, around, and through us. At an early stage of my research, I'm looking forward to discuss during the panel about the opportunity to design masks as a tool to explore new materialities and how it can provide new forms of communication between human and non-human agencies. Gaston Bachelard tells us whenever we want to read a person's face, we tacitly accept that face as a mask. In other words, like in theater, where actors are using their mask to perform a character, we are using our face to express our emotions and perform a personal version of our identity to the others. More than ever, facial expressions are indeed the most important tool of communication with our environment, as nowadays we communicate only through the screen interface and are unable to access visually the information given by the rest of our bodies. Therefore, putting a mask layer between our face and the others is not allowing us to be read as an other self, but merely as an extension or as another perspective of ourselves. If we look at the history of masks, beside working as a protection and as a concealment tool, as we learn to know them so well in the current pandemic, masks as a statement have always been there. They have a long history in performing rituals or in emulating theatrical characters or even alien characters. Today, it is interesting to note that in response to the pandemic and also the surveillance society, masks are coming out of the theater stage and the fashion shows into the streets and have invaded our visual environments not only as a fashion accessory or protective gear, but also as a political tool. More and more in our contemporary society, like clothes, masks, and head coverings are worn as an identity statement. As Sears Eldredge wrote, the mask is the reality, and the mask is the text. In other words, between you and me, the interface is the mask. From a puppetry perspective, masks, like puppets, are extensions of the body of the performers. The mask on the body acts as a transformation and a communication tool, while they generate narratives and bring forth uncanny, although likable characters. Behind the mask, our bodies interact with the materiality of the masked object set on our faces. On the other side, the viewers shift their focus from one reality to another, from the human head to the masked body ensemble. In summary, while concealing a part of our humanity, face and head coverings open a nonverbal communication channel to alien characters. Wearing a mask, we perceive our environment through the mask, and we interact with each other through them. Looking at the wearer, we read the stories performed by the mask as a catalyst, a frame, a mirror, or a mediator. Catalyst. As Napier underlines, the principal function of the mask is to transform and thereby unite, or perhaps more fundamentally to unite and thereby transform. In literature, masks have been widely studied for their function of transformation and ability to stimulate change and transition. In art therapy, masks are emulating a safe space where the mask wearer can start his healing process. In puppetry, masks extend the body of the performers and create a narrative space where the stories are told. Frame. The mask is framing my body. The mask impersonates me as long as I am using it. Looking at my mask, you shift your focus from the reality of my face to the reality of the mask plus body. The mask hides and reveals or points out at something specific from me. It is a psychic template. It reveals certain aspects of my physical, emotional, and mental life. The ensemble mask plus wearer's body has a life history on its own. As Eldredge stated, we make our mask, and afterward, our masks make us. Mirror. Let us introduce now how the perception can be different from the two sides of the mask. Whether the mask is in paper or leather, heavy or light, will change how the object affects the face of the mask wearer and subsequently his body. In that sense, the mask echoes or amplifies the wearer's movements and emulate a character. Or put it in another way, the mask borrows the performer's body to express its identity. In the process, the performer is delivered from the empowerment of his face and mind over his body. On the other side, we, as spectators, map our own affect to the object mask extended by the wearer's movement. We see a surface reflection of ourselves and our world. How the actor's body plays the mask produces a narrative which completes this reflection. In other words, the mask wearer is holding up two-way mirror, one to him and one to the audience, a mirror composed by the mask and the rest of his body. Consequently, the mask extended body reflects two narratives. The first one, taken from our perception as viewers, and the other, sourced by the wearer's feedback to the mask. Therefore, both spectators and wearer are reflected in the mask. Mediator. Equally important in theater is how masking has the power to mediate between two realities, the spiritual and the material. And as Eldredge reminds us, how the collective unconscious, that is the ambivalences and contradictions latent in a culture, are acted out. With the mask on the body, the audience is sharing the reality of the body over the reality of the face, which is usually predominant. As Elizabeth Tonkin resumes, the mask mediate and direct the flow of power within a system. As such, as masks act as mediators, they give us access to alternative realities we could not access without them, as Dr. Brownie, a fantastic keynote illustrated with her exploration of space costume. In addition to be a powerful tools of nonverbal communication, masks are a tool for storytelling. Therefore, I propose to address the mask thinghood when the object becomes the other and looks back at you. Exploring the thinghood of the mask is to explore the mask not only as an interface, but also as an object who exists prior and without its wearer, and which transforms as much as it is transformed. As Rush and Keys stated, the effects that objects achieve in terms of their communicate value are dependent not only upon arrangement, but also upon variations of material, shape, and surface. Which means that designing a thing mask is to explore how, and I quote again, any material evokes tactile and thermal images of smoothness, roughness, hardness, softness, coldness, and warmth. All set of chords of tactile images that often produces sharp and immediate physical and emotional reactions among the viewers. I want to share here some example of mask thing, which appears to have agency when activated by the wearer. In this silicone mask, embedded with color changing liquid, Aposema, designed by D. Meyer, is a speculation of a near future where the mask thing read facial expressions performed by the user and translate their emotional status into a set of colors. In her scenario, the mask would constantly scan the wearer's environment and recognize the pattern presented on other masks. With crocheted masks in different patterns from different materials, Thread Stories produces uncanny extension of the mask to obscure and transform the wearer and create unexpected narratives. In the same vein, with Exploded View, made of paper and glue, designers Lucy McRae and Bart S. are looking at how masking changed the expressivity of the wearer's body and turned them into a post-human creature. Finally, artist Max Sidentoft is reflecting on the use of different material to make protective masks while challenging the viewer senses. Let me share now a particular mask used in physical theater to help actors to produce visuals with their body-mind responses, the neutral mask. Created by Jacques Lecoq and Amleto Sartori, the neutral mask are leather masks designed to show all emotions of the human being. When improvising with the neutral mask, and even before playing it, the performer is invited to study the mask thingness. This study could last for 8 days before the student is allowed to wear the mask. Through a series of identification exercises, the participants are requested to imagine with their body-mind non-human entities such as natural elements, color, sounds, or vegetation. The same mask will behave differently as it responds to the bodies of each performer. Performers, by becoming aware of the mask thingness and the body's responses, can either use them to form a character or neutralize them. How the performer will physically engage with the smell or the weight of the mask will feed his improvisation. There is no speaking in the neutral mask. Overall, the performer is invited to surrender his identity to the world of the mask. As Jacques Lecoq stated, if the neutral mask looks at the sea, it becomes the sea. On the other hand, on the other side of the mask, we react both physically to the images triggered. On the other side of the mask, we react both physically to the images triggered in our imagination and the information performed by the mask thing. As Elizabeth Tonking reminds us, the observer of mask is by no means passive, by a participator caught up in a drama through which he or she is something actually changed. In summary, the mask becomes a portal through which information is shared visually. Information is collected by the mask, translated by the performer, and communicated to the viewer. Translated in everyday life, the mask as a portal is an opportunity to build a nonverbal communication channel between us and our environment. In conclusion, exploring the mask as a thing and as a portal rather than an object is to focus on the variations of the material in use in the mask and how the material can expand the scope of not only the face, but also the body expressivity, and how it can be intentionally used to sense and interact with non-human agencies. Furthermore, reading a textile material through mask making has the potential to produce unexpected encounters and understanding for the designer. It provokes different enactment of the material agencies and reveals not only the aesthetic or the potential function of the material, but also its metaphoric power. Finally, It calls to use the mask as a storyteller in its own right and as an antenna to perceive and respond to our environment. From this perspective, the mask thing is an opportunity to change our perception of the world from visual to other senses, such as smell, sound, or touch, to image other frames, to reflect other image of the world, to mediate something other than humans, and as a result, to transform us. Thank you.
Sabrina, thank you so much for that. Some really wonderful examples. And in some ways, as you were talking there towards the end of your presentation, sort of tapping into perhaps some of the points that Barbara is making about sort of post-human, kind of looking beyond the body. Hopefully we will be able to pick up some of those strands a little bit later after we've heard from the other two talks in this panel. So continuing that theme then of storytelling, but moving to a slightly different arena, we're now going to hear from Linda Kvitkina, an independent academic based in Russia. And Linda's work is focusing very much on dance and dance practitioners, and specifically looking at ballet and the role of masks and head coverings in that context. So as I said, very much continuing that theme of storytelling. So Linda's talk then, head coverings in ballet concerning the real person. So Linda, the virtual stage is yours. If you share your screen, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yes, we can, yeah. And we can see your screen.
Figure out the presentation. Sorry. It's a bit confusing. Right, so yeah, I'm extremely happy to be part of this panel. I think the previous talk was absolutely fascinating and amazing, and I'm going to talk mainly about two uses of head coverings of different kinds, of different sorts in ballet. The first one would sort of focus on maintaining traditional representation of a dancer and signifying their identity, essentially, but concealing the person behind and not focusing on their unique features. And the second use, it will sort of talk about both male and female dancers using head coverings and masks, mainly of animals that they are performing. And in my concluding remarks, I decided to touch very briefly upon a new use of face masks in ballet and how it works, if it does. Sorry. Okay. So one of the most notable examples of using head coverings in classic ballet is Giselle. The second part of the ballet takes the spectator to a graveyard where the spectator meets the village that you see on the photo here. So they are spirits of girls who died after being betrayed by men they loved, and their floating ethereal image is emphasized by costumes and the coverings on their heads as if on a wedding day. And however, they look somewhat hidden, so a spectator would not be able to make any judgment about their personality or notice their unique appearance features, which is a common feature in classical ballet approach that the corps de ballet is kind of acting as one body, emphasizing the movement of the main character only. The covering in this case also points at the importance of wedding as part of woman's life, as seen from the traditional perspective of gender roles, and especially on Romanticism era when this ballet was created. It is rather rare to show a wedding with its clearly recognizable visual attributes in ballets, but in the 1960s, it was, sorry for the quality of picture, but this was the best I could find. In the 1960s edition of The Nutcracker of the Bolshoi Theatre, there is a wedding at the end of the ballet, which is very unusual, extremely rare, and it has this same kind of head covering that we saw in Giselle, but Giselle is quite a bit more mysterious and unnerving, and this is just something that we're more used to see on weddings, etc. in real life. It is used in the same way as on the wedding ceremony, so it is lifted and the marriage is sealed after that. Other cases of maintaining traditional female image, even though exoticized, can be seen in The Legend of Love. It's also a 20th century ballet from 1960s of the same choreographer, by the way, as The Nutcracker. And the head covering here signifies the reference to a place, not quite specifically, but where ballet is set. I have to say here that it is a very generalized point of view, and it is an Orientalist perspective that can be seen clearly, but this is how it was. And what was interesting in the early Soviet ballet is that the head coverings were used both by women and men, I'll show a picture later, to kind of paint a broader picture and unify dancers, to show them as sort of one body, much like in Giselle and other classic ballets, or to show their occupation. For example, this brilliant picture you can see from this tight hats that are fitted like very close to the head, that they're sportsmen, and this is kind of visual significance of it. Head coverings in ballet called the Golden Age, produced in 1930 in the Soviet Union, were used to distinguish the characters, on the contrary, involved, and that relied heavily on the stereotypes again, and already existing imagery. So here you can see a character called Diva at the very center, and it's 1920s decadent kind of silent movies heroine, and the two other characters that are fascists. Summing up, when portraying human characters, head coverings in ballet may be used either to stereotypically refer to identity of character, even if in an exoticized manner, or to show their occupation. So this is part of an identity that is, however, directed at the unification, not at showing that this character has a personality that is unique. However, the common use of various head coverings in different editions of classic ballets that are mostly set in Europe and refer to other cultures only in character dances, not in the main narrative, is to portray wedding as a crucial element, the crucial point in life of a female character, which is also generalization, displaying and it displays an extremely traditional and sort of conventional look of at the female characters, with their fate seemingly determined by default and not discussed at all. Like, there are not many options in ballet narratives to be remodeled, reconfigured and discussed. Now I'm going to move on to the second part of kind of the big separation of how the head coverings and masks are used in ballet. One is to show humans, the other is to show animals. And the animalistic masks conceal the performer fully or significantly, at least the head. I will show other examples a bit later. And in classic ballets, they are generally used in stories that are easily accessible to kids. These are images from different editions in different theatres, performing the Nutcracker, for example. So the rats, and the Rat King is one of the probably most famous images for kids as well. It can be followed through to much earlier productions when head coverings also were used. And I think that the major difference here is, first of all, the material that was made. So here we see a lot of fabric used while in the contemporary versions, it's a lot of fake fur or plastic details, or yeah, it's a bit more detailed. So here it's a bit generalized, right? But another major difference between these two is that in the modern versions, we don't see any alterings of the body of a dancer, while in the older versions, this is from the end of 19th century, this is a archival photo from Mariinsky Theatre. They try to alter the shape of the body to make the rats appear a bit bigger. Right, so this could be purely practical decision to say no to any alterings of the body, or it could be in compliance with ballet body conventions that we have now. So this is the two possible explanations I'm ready to offer. In the Sleeping Beauty, in the very last part of ballet, when there are other characters from fairy tales introduced, such as the Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, and the Puss in Boots. Male performers tend to wear masks that hide their face significantly more than their female counterparts, and this can also be seen from the archival imagery here. So this is Little Red Riding Hood on the right, and the cat on the left, in the picture on the left, is, yeah, the male performer uses more masking and concealing the hair, and he's wearing the mittens, so his body is also covered more in costume to make him appear more animalistic than that of a female performer. This could be partially because of the way the place of a male performer on ballet stage looks like. It has been a very long, and I don't think it's finished, process to recognize male performers as fully equal dancers in ballet, because at the very beginning they were mostly considered as just a supporting dancer, not really of their own right, and female dancers were in the focus, partially because of the male gaze that was common in the era and that was accepted, but right now the convention is changing. We see a lot of other tendencies there. To sum up, in some animalistic performances, it is only body of the performer that gives us information about what the performer is like, if we come back to the rats. The technology of making animalistic characters has certainly changed, but male performers still tend to be wearing more concealing masks compared to those worn by women. I am going to finish my brief presentation with outlining a recent example of new use of face masks by theatres. So this imagery is used a lot to be published on social media or generally in the media to emphasize and reassure that all necessary safety measures are implemented to attract and not to lose spectator. It's hard to say right now, will it play bigger role in attracting a spectator, but this has certainly been a trend, and However, they aren't using face masks during the performance, but they are using it, according to the pictures, in rehearsals. Yeah, I'm leaving my email on the screen, and you can contact me if you have any further questions, and I would be excited to receive any questions or comments later. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much for that. Very much as you said, continuing the theme from Sabrina's talk, and some interesting points there on gender that I think pick up on a major theme that emerged through yesterday's discussion. So it might be that we develop that a little bit further in the questions that follow. But before we do that, we are going to pick up on I suppose another point that you were making there about choreography and how better then to conclude this panel in thinking about choreography than going to the court of Versailles. And we're going to hear from a colleague here at Manchester Metropolitan University, Dr. Jonathan Spangler, a senior lecturer in the Department of History. Many of you will probably be familiar with Jonathan's work, so a specialist in France and of course the Versailles Court, senior editor also of the Court Historian, and working on a book currently about the sort of second sons, the heirs in French monarchy. So Jonathan, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I check that you can hear me as well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep. Okay, and you can see my screen?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Good. Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of a run through, I think, of a lot of different ideas. I may have bit off more than I can chew in this, and I should also explain that I'm kind of a political and social historian more than I am a cultural historian, but I thought it would be interesting to dive into some of the ideas about both masks and headgears. So I'm actually going to talk a lot about hats. And so I'm going to whiz through two general ideas, one of which you've probably heard of, which is the man in the iron mask. And the other one is one that you, I'm sure, haven't, which is a fairly small affair, which is called the Affair of the Bonnet, which happened in 1716, right after the year of the death of Louis XIV. So I'll explain both of those, and hopefully these two themes will kind of weave together in a coherent way. I have to admit, not having access to much of my library books has been a bit of an interesting challenge, but let's see if this can work. In general, I was musing a little bit on what was spoken in the keynote yesterday about how the etiquette and the customs around mask wearing really are very dynamic and not very static, and so they're always changing and moving, and that's something that will come out in the images that I'm going to show you today. So they can either draw attention to the person, or they can hide the person, or hide the identity or the intentions of that person. So I think some of the words that we look at with either mask wearing in the late 17th century or head covering is that they either transform a person, or they augment a person, or they can hide a person, or try to forget a person. So I think there's a lot of that at play here. And in the end, the sort of thing that I'm going to conclude is that really both of these, hats and masks, are very much about honor or dishonor. And I'm going to try to make the point that hats focus a lot more about raising your status and your rank, whereas masks, sort of contrary to what I had initially thought, are really much more about hiding you and forgetting you. So the honor goes to the hat, and the dishonor seems to go more to the mask. All right, so with that said, this is just some ideas that are floating around in our heads. Hat etiquette is still around, at least all the way up until the 1940s. I saw yesterday, while I was pulling these things together, Emily Post was just writing about it the other day, that a man should still take his hat off, etc. And then I liked this image very much from the 19th century of the 17th century. So a lot of the images we have of the 17th century, in fact, come from the 19th, and we always need to be aware of that. This is a sort of romanticized view of a highway robbery going on, where the man is wearing a mask, but he's also being a gentleman and raising his hat. So I think there's an interesting kind of contrast going on there, in that he's both hiding his intentions and revealing that he's a gentleman, and showing courtesy towards the man he's about to rob. So before we launch into the topics, one of the things that really first sprung to mind when I wanted to think about masks was the idea of Louis XIV appearing as Apollo and appearing in ballets, or things that we call the mask. So this connects a little bit with the topic of ballet that we just heard somewhat about. And more I found that it seemed that, although of course there are masks in the period, most people focus much more on the extravagance of costume in their dress or their headgear or things like that. And I found very few actual masks. So the very famous image on this one side is of Louis XIV himself as a young man dancing as Apollo. And he's got quite a lot of gear here, but not an actual mask. But I wanted to make sure that I'm not forgetting something. And so there are two examples in these other paintings of actual members of the royal family, clearly with masks in their hands. The one at the top is Louis's wife, Queen Marie-Thérèse, with their son, the Dauphin, and she's holding a mask. This painting is entitled The Mask of Poland, and I'm not entirely sure what that means. I wasn't able to find out more about it, but I suppose it's just national costume. And the more you look into it, the more you find that these masks are really about representing costumes or professions. So again, very much what Linda was just speaking about in her last paper. The couple then at the bottom are actually brother and sister. This is Louis XIV's nephew, the Duke of Chartres, and his sister, Mademoiselle de Chartres. And he's just obviously had some kind of performance off to the side. We know the royal family spent quite a lot of time doing am-dram, and that's how they spent their time. Moving forward a little bit, I wanted to go to one of the most famous masked balls. This is almost always listed as Le Bal Masqué. It's from the 1740s, so a bit later, but I scrutinized this image very, very closely, and I actually don't see anyone wearing masks. Although there's lots of large, huge, extravagant, oversized costumes, it's sometimes called the yew tree ball, and those people are actually dressed as yew trees. And the more I searched, the more I found that masked balls, it was more important to represent yourself as a Turk, or as a Spanish peasant, or as a shepherdess. And so it really was about costume and headgear more than it was about masks. So that got me thinking about other things that I know more about. This is one of the most famous events of the early reign of Louis XIV, and a piece that I have focused on a little bit. I love this event, the Grand Carousel of 1662, with about 3,000 horses all doing a ballet in front of the palace of the Louvre, between the Louvre and the Tuileries. And there were 4 teams, and each of them is representing a different nation. So one of the men that I work on most is Monsieur, Louis XIV's brother, and he's represented here as the King of the Persians. And my former subject, my PhD topic, are the Dukes of Guise, and here the Duke of Guise is portrayed as the King of the Americans, and whatever that means in 1662 with stakes. But neither of these men are wearing masks, so it's very much all about the hats. So I wanted to look then at hats. I think that it's really important to recognize that everything at court is about rank and position, the whole layout of the rooms. Obviously, I don't have time today to give you the whole history of layout and etiquette and how close you could get to the king or not. But displaying your hat or not became a really important marker of social hierarchy. And if you look online or in encyclopedias, a lot of places say this derives from chivalry, from the Middle Ages, from raising your visor to show your face in order to show honor, which I think is probably true. But I also think that it comes a lot from the church and the whole idea of having a canopy over anything that's holy or royal. So in the medieval Catholic Church, the host always had a canopy over it, And by the early modern period, anybody who is a sacred, divinely appointed monarch puts a canopy over their throne, over their bed, over their table. And I think that the hat is an extension of that. So in this image from 1693, we have Louis XIV receiving new members of the Order of Knighthood called Saint Louis, and you'll see that everyone in the room has taken their hat off, except for the king, because the king is the senior most person in the room. So that's the very simple, straightforward way of looking at it. It's a display of power. This famous portrait of the ambassadors from the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, comes and very clearly showing obeisance to the French king, who is wearing his hat. But there's also, I think, a bit of nuance here, and you have to remember that it's not always as simple as yes or no. So he does have his hat on, and one of them clearly has taken his hat off, but a lot of them also have their hats on. So more about the etiquette is also about whether you are higher or lower, whether you are further or closer, or whether you are seated or standing. So people who write about the court in the late 17th century are very attuned to all of these differences. Here's another one, quite similar. This is the Doge of Genoa. Genoa has just been defeated by the French Navy, and so he's coming to humbly bow forgiveness. But here you'll see that the king has taken off his hat, and both of them have taken off their hat to each other. So it's a slight suggestion of, okay, the war is over, now we can be friends. The other item that I would certainly point out in this picture is, again, it's about steps, how high you are standing on the steps, but also what colors you're wearing. So the gentleman right in the front is wearing something called the justaucorps bleu, which is restricted to a very, very few members of the inner circle of the king. He's also got that classic example of the red high heels. And so there are all kinds of visual markers at the court of Versailles beyond just hats. Here again is another example. Louis XIV has taken off his hat, is holding it in his left hand, while he receives the ambassadors from the Swiss cantons. And the Swiss are his allies, so he is bareheaded in front of them rather than a symbol of dominance. And then finally, the last of these examples, sorry if I'm going through these fairly quickly, is a modern version of an older print, slightly cheesy, in which the king is sitting and has his hat on, but this is the ambassador from the Pope, a cardinal. So he also has his hat on and is also sitting. So here's a real strong symbol that the King of France sees himself as on an equal par with the Pope in Rome. So what do I want to look at in terms of these hats? I want to look specifically at this event called the Affaire du Bonnet, or the affair of the bonnet. Better than this, it should be called the mortarboard. And this is a seating of the Parlement of Paris, the top law court in France, where right after Louis XIV has died, they all have to meet basically to confirm the new government of the new king, who is just an infant. And on the far right, you will see in black all of the dukes and peers wearing their hats, and in front of them all the presidents of the parliament, who have little hats on, berettas, but also these things which are their bonnets, or their mortarboards. I'll move forward into a closer version. So this is what we're talking about, this little round thing that looks like a cake. This is their hat. And the dukes always claimed that because they were ancient nobility, that they should keep their hats on and that the presidents should take their hats off. The presidents saw that they were the representatives of the king, representatives of the law and of justice, so therefore shared in royal sovereignty and insisted that they should keep their hats on, as they have them here in this seating. So it sounds like a really, really small, finicky detail, but it caused quite a furore, quite a scandal, and the two groups fought each other in the courts for about 2 years, until finally the regent of France said that yes, the presidents who wore the mortarboard were of equal rank to the dukes and peers. And you can see this in books that are subsequently printed in the 18th century in France. These are both coats of arms for non-noble, i.e. judiciary families, so presidents of the Parlement, not old sword nobles. And yet, although you can see that on the top is this kind of mortarboard, they are also wearing quite clearly ducal coronets. So very clearly they are claiming that they are of equal rank to the dukes, and the conflict supposedly is resolved. Okay, so then I ask the second question of this quick presentation of what then therefore is a mask for, if it's really your hat that raises or lowers your status, or those other things like height, chairs, proximity. A lot of people tried to make something out of sexual deviance, and when people were looking quite a lot in the 1660s, the memoirs of the Abbé de Choisy became quite popular, and in his memoirs he describes how, as an abbot, he used a mask sometimes to appear in public dressed as a woman, and gradually, little by little, he changed his cassock, his abbot's costume, until he appeared fully in public as a woman and then could stop wearing the mask. This is very scandalous, very shocking. It appeals to those who are interested in deviance from the period. But more recently, people have queried whether or not these memoirs are actually true, or whether he wrote them as a fictional account of something that he would have liked to have happened. So I'm just going to sort of dismiss that and move on then to our second case. And this is the Man in the Iron Mask. You've probably heard stories about it or seen images about it. These are two of the earlier ones, close to the time period, from the later half of the 18th century. We don't have anything from the beginning of the 18th century when he actually supposedly died. The problem with the Man in the Iron Mask is that there's very little actual information about who he was or why he was in prison for so long. The discovered dead person in the Bastille was about 1703, and there are letters and memoirs and diaries that appear within that next decade. So we know that he was a real person. He did exist, but nobody really knew his identity. And if he'd committed such a crime that he was going to be in prison for his entire life and his face hidden behind a mask, if he'd committed such a horrible crime, why wasn't he just executed? That's one of the biggest questions. And so there have been millions and millions of suggestions, but a lot of them come from later in the century. The first real people to write about him were Voltaire and the Duke of St. Simon, writing in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. And mostly they are offering this as a bit of a critique against the regime of Louis XIV. And especially St. Simon are really concerned about decadence, deviance, illegitimacy. And so a lot of the stories then start to circulate that the Man in the Iron Mask is a bastard, an illegitimate child of the king, or maybe an illegitimate brother of the king. And out of that, you get other stories, most famously probably then by Alexander Dumas. So most of what we think we know about the Man in the Iron Mask is from the Three Musketeers novels. So it's fiction. And so our 19th century views of the Man in the Iron Mask as this gentleman who drank wine and played the guitar, or often the cello, or the viola da gamba, I suppose, and then transformed even more into Hollywood films from the 1930s, 50s, all the way up to Leonardo DiCaprio in 1998. And this DiCaprio version goes strictly with the Dumas version, which is that the Man in the Iron Mask is Louis XIV's secret twin brother, who obviously looked like the king, so therefore had to have a mask the whole time. The earliest indications are from the actual time period that the mask was in fact a piece of velvet cloth, and only later did the story come along that it was iron with a hinge, an iron hinge. But if you actually look at the evidence, and I don't want to go into all the details, there are lots and lots of books about speculating who the Man in the Iron Mask was or wasn't. You find that there was a prisoner who was transferred in 1669 from one prison to another under tight security, and there's a very deliberate line in the letter that says, make sure his face is covered all the time. That's the only clue really we have of who he was. There's then lots of propositions that come forward, but the most recent from 2014, Paul Sonino's suggestion, is that he was in fact a secretary who knew too much about how much money had been stolen from the government treasury, from which Louis XIV profited. So he was someone who hadn't actually committed a crime, but obviously never needed to be seen or heard from again. That's kind of where I think we are, which is not a very nice, exciting story. So people tend to go back to the Alexander Dumas version, which is much, much more interesting. Most recently, the television show Versailles revived it, brought it back, and changed it slightly. Instead of saying a secret twin brother, they said it was actually the father of Louis XIV, who was not Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, so therefore was hidden for all of his life. Though, of course, if he had died in 1703, that would have made him well over 100 years old, probably. So where does this all take us? Just to finish off, I guess, is that we have these conflicting ideas about honor and dishonor that are revolving around masks and about hats. And to take it all the way up to the end of the Ancien Regime, under Louis XVI, the very last of the Bourbon kings, you have two contrasting images. The first here is as a young king on the far left. He's receiving his top aristocrats and indeed his younger brothers as members of the Order of the Holy Ghost, the Saint-Esprit, and here very clearly he's the only one who is hatted. The others are bareheaded. But then the revolution breaks out, and in a kind of interesting twist of events, people want the king to become a citizen. They want him to be Louis Capet, and so in this very popular cartoon, you see Louis XVI has been given a Phrygian cap with the cockade of the Revolutionary Order, and he's having to drink this wine that says "Vive la Nation." And so in this instance, the hat has now degraded the king from being God's anointed, God's chosen, to being just one of the gang, one of everybody else. Obviously, this didn't work, and Louis XVI lost his head about a year later, and so he had no hat at all. So that's probably an appropriate way to end. Thanks.
Jonathan, thank you very much for that. And looking at, I think, masks and head coverings, and again, in a way that we haven't really considered sort of so far in this sort of conference, in terms of thinking about, as you say, their sort of status as much as identity as well. So 3 talks then in that panel that we're thinking about visual markers across different chronologies, cultures, and geographies. And as we saw there, expressing status, but also in other talks, emotions and distinction and criminality. So I will sort of officially open the floor if people have questions for our 3 panelists. I wanted to pick up on a question or sort of statement that appeared in the chat as the panelists were talking. So this is a comment from Ksenia talking about rats. So this linking to Linda's presentation more specifically, and rats did get quite a lot of attention in the chat. So I'll read out Linda's comment, and then Linda, sorry, I'll read out Ksenia's comment, and then Linda, maybe you can talk to it. So there is a consistent thread starting from Rousseau and going through to the 19th century, criticizing civilized men, and of course women, for deforming not only their bodies in compliance with fashion, but also those of animals. What they meant was breeding and selection, cutting dogs' tails and ears, etc. But based on Linda's material, we could also look at what was happening to symbolic animals. In theatre, perhaps also book illustrations and toys, how their bodies were disciplined and rendered fashionably elegant. And maybe there are alternative representations, more other. Sorry, Linda, any remarks to that comment?
I honestly think that this was a surprising one for me, because I didn't really see it this way. But yeah, when I saw this brilliant rats from 19th century, that was amazing. We know that ballet conventions were different at the time as well. So they were not as thin dances as they are now. There was quite significantly, the training was significantly different, so it would form a different kind of body, and the goal of a dancer would be different, not to be physically successful, but yeah, they had slightly other interests discussed in the literature elsewhere. But I think that the animals, it's easy to I think that the book illustrations is one of the most accessible points here, because we do have a lot of material from different eras, and when I worked with a private library in Italy, I could see all these illustrations that sometimes just animals do not look like the ones that they're depicting at all. So they would be radically different, and they would be really weird and strange, and just you don't understand what this animal actually is that they're referring to. But yeah, so I think this is something that can be discussed, because we do see animalistic world a lot from the anthropocentric perspective, which is a massive problem when we talk about Anthropocene and about our relations with nature, and the whole concept of separating human from nature and juxtaposing them. That also obviously has to be mirrored in the literature, and it has. So I think that this is an interesting point of view that I haven't really thought about before recently, but this will be interesting to develop further. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in terms of, I suppose, that not so much thinking of animals, but the connection between, I suppose, if you like, the sort of natural world and human world. Jonathan, as you were talking, you mentioned the yew tree ball. And obviously, you know, yew trees have a sort of deep significance. In terms of that ball of 1745, what was the significance of the yew tree in that context? I wasn't familiar with that.
I don't know. That's not. I usually know the context of why people were there and what they were saying. It's not normally my thing to understand what they're wearing. So I'd have to look into that. But it's certainly playing on. I think the exoticism is more what I've looked at in that image, and the constant draw of Eastern costume and Turkish costume. The yew trees obviously are all over the gardens in Versailles, so it might be just a reflection of inside versus outside, but I wouldn't want to say. The context of that particular ball is that it was the coming of age party of the king's son, the Dauphin. And usually that image is rolled out when they're talking about Madame de Pompadour, because that's how somehow she became the mistress of the king.
Okay.
So there's all, I guess it's about transgression.
Yeah,
that's maybe
thinking about transgression then, a question about the man in the iron mask, if indeed there was such a character. I mean, I was interested because it's sort of wearing my, if you like, sort of my medieval hat and sort of thinking about sort of earlier research. In the sort of medieval period, if people had committed a particularly heinous crime, often that was conveyed with corporal punishments. They would lose a body part, an ear, a hand, or something like that. And I was trying to sort of think as you were talking, looking for the sort of fact in the fiction, as it were, what punishments did I know of, or could I think of, where the sort of identity of a criminal would be effaced, sort of physically with some sort of mask or something. And that still slightly, it kind of eludes me. I mean, I'm still thinking of those, as I said, losing a hand or something like that. So I'm wondering if in sort of France and the period that you're more familiar with, and the period in which those stories of the Man in the Iron Mask are based, what are the sort of punishments that are sort of being meted out? Are there analogous sort of punishments where an identity would be wholly concealed, where a mask would be worn, or some sort of physical concealment device would be used?
Well, I think there's a couple things there. The example that springs to mind immediately, and I was thinking about this recently in terms of the US situation right now, and how how people can forget and move on. But I think the biggest thing is about forgetting. And so the Doge of Venice, I think Faliero is his name, in the 16th century, who had done so many crimes against the state. If you go into the Doge's palace in Venice, there's a wall that has every single portrait of every single one of them, and one of them has simply been covered with black paint. And certainly in my time period in France, if you've done something really awful, one of the really bad crimes or punishments is simply having your name struck off formal lists. So, for example, the Order of the Holy Ghost, the Saint-Esprit, the most honorific thing you want, and all aristocratic families really fight for the right to be a member of that order. If you're struck from it, you simply don't exist. And it penalizes your whole family. And then I guess then the final thing to answer that question would be just one of the most often repeated anecdotes of the period is about being seen. And when everyone's crowding inside Versailles, the one honor that you want is to be invited to Marly for the weekend. And if Louis XIV kind of walks through the room and doesn't notice you, then you haven't been seen, and therefore you don't exist. And one of his favorite quotes, or famous quotes, is, whether he said it or not, is, "I've never seen him." If people say, "Oh, would you like to honor this person with a job in the military or a position in the church?" If the king says, "I do not see him," then it means he doesn't exist. So that's kind of I guess you could call it a conceptual mask.
Yeah, that's a nice
physical mask.
Yeah, and again, I think as you were saying, I mean, I think in terms of the effacement of a criminal, sort of again thinking back to sort of Anglo-Saxon England, that idea that you would become a nithing, a nothing, that your legal status would be revoked. So we have a point, I think, linked to that in the chat from Francis. So it reminds me of the punishment of Triasis, who changed from man to woman, so knew the secrets of both sexes, maybe, was struck blind by the other gods. His eyes were closed to limit his knowledge. He cannot be seen, like blind masked justice. An interesting comment there. Thank you for that. I was also thinking, I mean, in terms of, I suppose, a question for Sabrina and Linda, sort of reflecting on both of your talks together. So if I maybe direct it first to Linda on Sabrina's talk, and then we can maybe sort of flip that. But I was wondering, Linda, as you were thinking, obviously, about the ballet, whether you could kind of see a occasion or see the merits of maybe incorporating within the ballet some of the masks that Sabrina showed in her talk. I was thinking particularly of the sort of silicon mask where in colors change in terms of conveying emotion, whether from your kind of perspective of the ballet or other, I suppose, stage performances, that there might be merit in that. We could see that crossover or not. So maybe if Linda could take that, and then Sabrina, it'd be nice to hear your responses.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that my personal view is that ballet is an extremely traditional art form, and it's very reluctant to changes, if I'm honest. Some countries introduce new additions and new tweaks and changes easier. Something that I have seen in Royal Opera House, for example, with Pleasure and Northern Ballet Company in Leeds, I think, does introduce some of the changes, but for example, Russian ballet companies are quite reluctant to change even the setting. The setting looks like it's from this last century. Like that's not particularly entertaining anymore. And I think that masks will be definitely kind of thought through in the process of creating performances. But I would definitely say that I think we're more likely to see it in contemporary dance or performance arts, because there is just movement towards something that is more honest. There is a spirit of exploration of new ways of communicating with the audience, of creating new participatory formats. So yeah, I mean, I personally, as a practitioner and performer, I would definitely be delighted to explore that, because I think that we are rethinking masks in a way. Like 2020 has made it quite like different, because if before we thought probably as masks connected to carnivals and all this kind of entertainment, now we think of it as safety, as medicalized notion that way, but maybe it would be actually fun, to be honest, to go into some other formats. That would be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So Sabrina, in terms then of, those variety of masks that you showed us, I mean, I alluded to the silicone mask with the lights, but you showed others. I suppose in the first instance, could you see them being applied to the arena in ballet or other contexts?
Yes. Like Apozema, the designer, set her mask on dancers to demonstrate the concept. Actually, so I don't know if maybe I can share that, or I don't have time. But it's a matter of the relation of this ancient art of dance, acting, or theater with technology, actually. So it's how you embed technology into your art and how you evolve from that, So and there's a lot of initiative around that nowadays. In physical theater, in contemporary dance, as Linda stated, they are trying projection. They're trying puppets on stage. They're playing with they're dancing with robots. Biancali is one of the first performer to have actually danced with robots. So it's performing machines. Actually dance is very hard discipline, and for the body is to control everything. And mask with new material, it's about listening to the material and surrender to the material through the mask in a way. So it's a difficult balance to manage for dancers or for traditional performers. But for physical theater makers, it's really the way they do. It's like I said with the natural mask, they wait for 8 days before. I personally did that. You wait for 8 days before wearing the mask, because you have to study the mask thickness, mask, what the mask would tell you, and what image will convey the mask, not what your imagination, but the image conveyed by the mask. So it's a whole process, I think it's relevant if you want to explore new technologies, like the presentation of Dr. Brownie's about the space helmet. It was really fantastic presentation. I felt really connected to this, and how she introduced like the feeling of the astronaut behind this helmet is more like it's a total frame, because you don't see the astronaut at all. Even his body is completely constrained, So what you see is something completely uncanny, like post-human, between a human and a machine in a way. So it's a performative way to analyze the space helmet, but
I think that's true. And I think, just thinking about my remarks at the beginning of the symposium yesterday and quoting sort of David Sedaris, it was this idea of how we respond to the mask or to face coverings. But I think what's emerged, I think, as a theme throughout this symposium, but particularly perhaps in this panel, the way that, as you said, with sort of thinness, those masks or face coverings impose on us too and alter our behavior. So that was really interesting. Thank you. A comment from Helen, or rather a question from Helen to Linda. And Linda, Helen asks if you could say something about ballet masks in the early Soviet Union in the 1920s, possibly. Maybe this was a time in Russian arts when they were more open to modernism.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that, so when I was looking through the visual archives that are accessible through Bolshoi Theatre and through Mariinsky Theatre, I would say that for some reason this period is not really transparent, not as much as I would like that to be. But yeah, in the 1920s, though, it was difficult because it was an interesting time when ballet was more open to major public, because this was for the first time essentially when workers and anyone could enter the theatre and see the performance, because it used to be quite an elitist entertainment. So there is a possibility of more openness, but in 1920s, with the whole reorganization of theatres, one of the persons that was, for example, in charge of Mariinsky Theatre, back then it was called completely differently, I forgot the name, sorry, was Agrippina Vaganova, who's mostly known as a tutor, as a trainer for the dancers, and as teacher. So she wasn't like the head of theatre for a long time, because she was better as a tutor than as artistic director of theatre. And the funds, as you can imagine, right after the revolution, kind of after the Civil War, were limited massively. So I wouldn't say there was funding for the innovations to be really implemented. I think there were some interesting ideas in terms of costumes, but that 1920s was an interesting time when they were trying to kind of search for new ways, but it was stopped in the 1930s after the article published by Stalin. Presumably, it wasn't a signed article, but it was one of the main ones from the newspaper. That's why it's assumed that it was written by Stalin, that we have to be realistic. We have to research thoroughly the subject to kind of present anything. This is why Russian ballet went back to traditions, because it was just safer to work with what we had. And so maybe that we would have seen some experiments if there was better funding and more freedom, but that was difficult. Yeah, that's an interesting question though. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Linda, for your response, and Helen for the question. I think that's worked through the questions in the chat, so thank you very much for those. If we then draw that panel to a close, thank you so much for our speakers for their remarks, and again for the questions that have come through in the chat. Sabrina has posted their little YouTube clip relating to the comment that she was making. So that, I think, is something that we might all want to have a gander at in the short break that will now follow. So we will pick up with panel 2 at the hour, a panel about cultural memory chaired by Jonathan. So thank you so much for your contributions, and we'll see you shortly.